Hello, everybody. I'm Lucy Hartley, Professor of English and Secretary of the Ann Arbor chapter of the AAUP. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event, which is called Should University of Michigan Adopt Institutional Neutrality? A Faculty Perspectives Panel. The panel has been organized in response to recent developments at our university regarding the adoption of a statement on institutional neutrality. On September the 17th, 2024, the Advisory Committee on the University of Michigan Principles on Diversity of Thought and Freedom of Expression released a report. In this report, Subcommittee 3 recommended that the university adopt a statement of institutional neutrality. Following this recommendation, Regent Hubbard asked the General Counsel to draft a policy for consideration, and the University Record published a draft of this bylaw on October the 7th, 2024. Today, we've invited a few subject matter experts to discuss this issue. Because time is limited, I'm going to keep the introductions short and follow the order in which our experts will speak. First, Christina Dogadas is Professor of Law. She teaches and writes about international law and international institutions and issues of regulation. Second, Basit Zafar is Professor of Economics. His research focuses on labor economics, the economics of education, and household finance. Third, Hank Reichman is Professor Emeritus of History at California State University, East Bay. He was the chair of Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure for the AAUP National from 2012 to 2021. And he's the author most recently of The Future of Academic Freedom 2019 and Understanding Academic Freedom 2021. Our fourth speaker is Zilka Weineck, a professor of comparative literature and German studies. She works on philosophy and literature, on sport, and on the corporate university, and she's a past chair of SACUA. Our hope is that the perspectives of these experts will give us better insights into potential issues, benefits, and any unforeseen consequences of adopting such a policy. One important note. Today's panel ensures that the work of Subcommittee 3, which recommended the adoption of institutional neutrality, will be represented through the participation of its chair, Christina Dogadas. However, the report recommending institutional neutrality has been distributed widely to the entire university community, including via the University Record. That committee's perspective has therefore already been provided great weight and influence. Today's panel provides balance by permitting others from outside the committee an opportunity to share their perspectives. Such an opportunity is critical, given that a bylaw change implementing the committee's recommendation has been circulated for imminent adoption. Without further ado, let's welcome our first speaker, Christina Dogadas.
So thank you so much, Lucy. I want to start by also thanking Rebecca Modrek for organizing this faculty panel. This really is an important issue for the university community, and I have to say I've been genuinely surprised and dismayed by how much confusion and misinformation is circulating in our community about this issue. I hope that one thing we do today is clear up some of that confusion so that we can focus our discussion on the merits of the proposed bylaw, and I hope even find some common ground. Now, I want to be clear, not all objections to the proposed bylaw are based on misunderstandings, but I am convinced that at least some of them are. So part of the problem here is the label. Institutional neutrality is a charged and misleading term. It invites people to think that the policy requires universities to be neutral about everything. That's just wrong. Universities can't be, and they shouldn't be. So I'm going to continue to use this label as a shorthand because it's the language the proposed bylaw uses, and it's still common in broader debates about this kind of policy. I am not using it because I think it's a great term. So let's talk about the proposed bylaw. The proposed bylaw makes two key distinctions. First, it draws a distinction between statements that university leaders make on behalf of the institution or some part of it versus statements that they make in an individual capacity. Second, the proposed bylaw draws a distinction between statements that are directly related to the internal governance of the university and everything else. So what does the bylaw do? The proposed bylaw addresses statements that are made by university leaders when they're speaking on behalf of the institution, that is, on behalf of the university or one of its colleges or schools or departments or other units. In these situations, the bylaw instructs university leaders to avoid making statements about social or political or legal developments unless those statements directly relate to internal governance. Importantly, the proposed bylaw does not impose any restrictions on speech by university leaders when they are speaking for themselves in their individual or their scholarly capacity. University leaders, like other faculty members, remain free to address whatever topics they choose in academic articles and op-eds, at conferences, in classrooms. It may be useful to illustrate this with an example, right? What does the proposed bylaw mean for how university leaders talk about abortion? Pursuant to the proposed bylaw, university leaders, when they are speaking on behalf of the institution, should not say things like, the Supreme Court's recent decision overturning Roe versus Wade is an outrage. However, university leaders, when speaking on behalf of the institution, are free to say things like, given the new legal landscape, let me explain the changes we're making or are not making to the curriculum in our medical school, or to the package of reproductive health services our undergraduate students have access to. That's because these are topics of internal governance. Finally, university leaders, speaking for themselves or in their individual or scholarly capacity, remain free to say whatever they want about abortion. Now, why is it that university leaders should stop making institutional statements about contested social and political issues that don't relate to internal governance? Let me offer 3 reasons. First, institutional statements set the wrong tone for an academic community. They discourage inquiry. Teaching and learning and scholarship thrive on curiosity and uncertainty and ongoing debate. Institutional statements suggest that complicated questions have only one correct answer and that we should all look to a university leader to find out what that answer is. No. Second, these statements damage our community. Institutional statements might temporarily satisfy some members, but they do so at the cost of alienating or angering other members of our community. They suggest that those who disagree are unwelcome and those who are unmentioned are unimportant. Third, institutional statements divert the time and energy of university leaders away from the things that they should be doing, like showing up for students in person with coffee and donuts to make human connections, like reaching out to their faculty colleagues with expertise to speak at pop-up panels or to rethink the curriculum or hiring priorities. I hope that with these examples, you can see that a policy of institutional neutrality is not a call for silence or passivity. Instead, by getting out of the business of making such statements, university leaders can redirect their scarce time and energy to initiatives that are aligned with the university's academic, scholarly, and teaching mission. So thank you. I look forward to the discussion and to your questions.
Our next speaker is Basit Zafar.
Great. So let me share my screen and let me know if you can see my screen. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So thank you for organizing this panel. Let me just jump right in. And before I talk specifically about the bylaw, I do want to talk a little bit about the process. So I think typically as economists or as researchers, when we're trying to fix a problem, that requires identifying what the issues are. And typically the way we do that is we go collect data or we see what data are available and what are the issues that we're trying to fix. So in this case, what happened is, and this is the mandate that the university gave these committees, that for some reason there was a deadline that was set that the recommendation had to come in before the start of the school year. So the work had to be completed by then. And as a result of that, no meaningful data could be collected because that takes time. So the report talks about this specifically, that, for example, U of M is one of the national leaders in survey research, but there was just no time to seek expertise from ISR or to conduct focus groups. So what was done instead was they went out and collected some qualitative feedback, which is better than nothing. But I just want to point out that when the committee says that we reviewed several thousand written submissions, that's correct. But that's based on about 3,000 data points. Half of them are staff. So when you look at the data, we basically have comments from less than 2,000 students or faculty. And that's from a body, the student and faculty size at the University of Michigan, 3 campuses, is well above 75,000 people. So we're talking about a response rate of less than 2% for students and less than 10% for faculty. So the point that I want to make here is that the data are just not representative enough or credible to be informative, and we just don't have any objective statistics. So it's hard to know what problem it is that we're trying to fix. And I just want to comment on one thing before I move to the subcommittee 3 specifically. Subcommittee 2 says that, okay, there are significant perceptions that U of M's climate of freedom of expression and diversity of thought is problematic. Now, again, this is based on this non-representative data. And the question that this raises is, first of all, are these perceptions well-grounded? And no one knows the answer because we don't have data on this. And then the second question is, because we don't know the perceptions are well-grounded, if the perceptions and feelings don't align with reality, is it the university's responsibility to cater to these perceptions, right? So I'm going to leave it at that because I have more to say about this, but maybe this will come in the questions and answers. So now let's talk about subcommittee 3 before we go to the bylaw specifically. So I do agree something needs to be done. So as everyone by now knows, the subcommittee makes a recommendation to adopt the Calvin Report's principles. The first thing that it does is it says, okay, it's going to preclude statements on matters of internal governance. Now, this raises 2 questions. It's very hard to know what is and what isn't an issue of internal governance. That's the first point. And the second thing is, who is going to decide that? And that's where I think there's going to be a lot of leeway for people who have that power. So I think it's basically introducing a lot of ambiguity. The second issue is the committee rightly points out that arguably the risk for statements is larger for departments because they have closer connections amongst individuals within the units who might not feel that they can express disagreement. I think that's true, but I can equally make the opposite argument, where one can argue that actually central administration has a lot more pressure on it. We do know this from President Ono's own leaked recent audio. And on the other hand, we also know that sometimes departments have expertise on the issues that are under discussion. And they should be making statements in those cases. All of us as researchers and as academics would agree on that. And they also have a closer understanding of the pulse of the community. So now let me talk a little bit about the bylaw. I don't have enough time to read it out. I've highlighted some sentences here. The first thing is something that I already alluded to. Who gets to define what is an issue of internal governance? The statement is extremely broad and ambiguous in terms of who the restrictions apply to: directors, chairs, others in similar positions. The statement also says that people can make statements in their individual or scholarly capacity. To me, the distinction between college administrators and statements that they make in their individual capacity is very blurry. We are researchers, we have independent identities. I'm not sure that's the case for university administrators. So while I agree that something needs to be done, to me, number one, this statement is too vague. It gives too much leeway to those in power to elevate or regulate certain viewpoints. It's still not clear to me what problem it's trying to solve. it only seems to create new ones by introducing additional ambiguity and noise in the process. And I'm glad that Christina was very clear about what the statement is about. I think the label of institutional neutrality is very problematic. And I know this is not something that the subcommittee's report actually talks about this. So it's something that I think for marketing purposes, it's very dangerous to label this as institutional neutrality. But I think what I worry about the current bylaw is just introducing a lot more ambiguity and uncertainty, and it's obfuscating the process even more. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Hank Reichman.
Hi, everybody. First of all, let me, as the sole non-Michigan faculty member on this panel, I want to thank everyone for this invitation, and it's really a privilege to talk to everybody. I want to talk about institutional neutrality, not so much with respect to the specific policy proposals at Michigan, being an outsider, but in general, how it's been approached nationally and what it means. And I generally find the concept of institutional neutrality to be not so much either right or wrong as fundamentally confused. And indeed, the level of confusion that Christina talked about at the beginning may be in good measure attributable to that. If we mean by neutrality the fact that universities as institutions and their institutional leaders should not be publicly weighing in on the myriad scholarly controversies that roil academic life every single day and hour of our lives, many of which do have broader political and social resonance, then that's really fine. It's undisputable. It would mean, however, so for example, that the university must defend not the ideas of its faculty, but their right to advance those ideas. So, for example, when a faculty member says something either in his or her research, in the classroom, as a citizen, that is controversial and gets attacked in the public sphere, it is not the job of the university leadership to step forward and disassociate the university from those ideas, or to condemn or to approve those ideas, but simply to, as vigorously as necessary, defend the right of the faculty member to advance those ideas, even where they are dissenting and maybe even offend members of the public or even of the university community. In that regard, that's true neutrality, defensive academic freedom is. However, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean to be neutral on issues that go fundamentally to the very nature of the university? Christina talked about the issue of abortion legislation and said that once this legislation is passed, it's not the university's job to criticize the Supreme Court's ruling or what have you. But let's look at a different sort of legal situation like we saw in Florida, where the state legislature adopted legislation about what could be taught in a university classroom in ways that deeply restricted the ability of the university to do its job. Was the university compelled to be neutral about that legislation as it was being debated in the legislature? Sadly, in fact, they were, but that's another story. But I don't think they should be. And the final point I want to make in this brief time is that universities, like all other institutions, must be judged not only by their words, but by their deeds. Actions, it's famously said, speak louder than words. And every single day, the university takes actions, indeed must take actions that imply a position, that imply a certain stance on an issue of controversy. And so I think we need to recognize that institutions cannot simply say, well, we won't say anything about that, but we're going to go do and act in certain ways that will, in fact, show clearly where we stand. And I'll wrap it up at that.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Zilka Weinek.
Ilka, you're on mute.
My apologies. Let me share my screen because it might be a little easier to read along. There we go. Okay. There we go. All right. Thanks for everybody. So there's some overlap with what I have to say with what my previous honored speaker said. So first of all, I want to say that I think the bylaw as it is currently written is largely unobjectionable. It says that leaders should not issue statements on behalf of the unit, right, under their authority, unless, and so on. I'm fine with that. I don't need my dean to speak for me. I don't need my chair to speak for me. But as Bazit has pointed out cogently, it's also incredibly vague. I'm not even sure what a statement is, who measures a direct relation to internal governance, what is a political and social issue. Christina added legal, but which is actually not in the bylaw, but I would also add ethical, right, which would not be covered. So I'm fine with people not speaking on their behalf, but I would point out, number two, that people actually very rarely do. The bylaw does not cover the sort of communications the report identifies as a concern. Very few statements on social and political issues of the day, again, vague, are actually issued by leaders on behalf of the unit. And when they do, they typically relate to matters of internal governance. For instance, statements on the handling of the geostrike, which provided a rash of departmental statements which would be allowed. The report saw the greatest threat of ideological pressures on the departmental level and identified groups of faculty as an especially acute threat. But the bylaw is in fact completely silent on faculty groups and protects their right, what I would see as their right to free assembly and free expression. So I suspect that actually very few statements that we have seen are covered by this bylaw as it is written. And it might be intended to suppress that kind of speech, but on the face of it, it does not, which is great, but also part of the confusion that Bazit identified. Now, third, I'm taking issue with this assumption that statements are received as speaking for anybody. I don't think if I read an email by President Ono, I do not say, oh, he has spoken for me, and this is now what I believe, and neither does anybody else. The students don't read them at all, as we all know. I think that on the contrary, statements like the ones President Ono has issued have fostered precisely the sort of passionate dissent and lively debate that the report wants and supports. So to the extent that some statements across campus relate to ideological conformity, and I take that point, I think it's correct, right? Even though hard to measure, but the statements are not the engine of that conformity, but the result of that conformity. And banning them will not lead to greater social acceptance of conservative minorities on campus. So I think this is cart before the horse. Notably, the vast majority of the conservative complaints in the comments related to policy and not to statements, predominantly DI, and UM's response to the protests. So I think the problem that the report identifies is actually not addressed by this bylaw. Then fourth, and several of the other speakers have already made that point, I cannot think of a single contested issue that is not also a matter of internal governance. Kind of have a hard time here reading my own slides. Okay. Sorry about that. So to my mind, the report includes two incompatible assertions. Number one, university leaders, I think, can and must make and defend many contestable and value-laden decisions about internal governance. We all agree on that. Two, universities must refrain from taking institutional positions on these issues, but passing a policy is taking an institutional position. So what the report leaves us with is that positions can and must be taken, but the reasons for taking them should not be publicly articulated. And I think that is a very bad state of affairs. I would argue conversely that rather than demanding no statements, we should demand fewer but much better statements, rather than the pablum we constantly get out of central administration as this kind of fire hose of stuff, right, that nobody agrees with, nobody disagrees with. It's just fairly meaningless. My last point, and that's a little bit a change of pace here. The University of Michigan is not an assembly of individual contractors. So this constant harping of individual faculty can still say their piece. Yes, that's very important and very great. But as an institution, we are powerful public institutions. We were one of the largest employers in the state. We're a main driver of Michigan's economy. And precisely as an institution, we have political aims. And we have the kind of power that individual faculty obviously do not have. We habitually exercise this power. We employ lobbyists in Michigan and in DC. Our regions are all parts of informal political networks, but also our regions are elected partisan officials. We vote for them on straight party tickets. A statement ban on the regions, which actually the report did not include, but the bylaw does, negates the will of the voters who elect regions precisely as political actors and drives the political activity in which we habitually engage underground, hiding it precisely from scrutiny and contestation we need. So once again, I would argue for fewer but better and more honest statements, for greater transparency rather than the vague and selective speech ban that this bylaw seeks to enact. Thank you. And I will stop the share.
Thank you to our speakers. I'm going to move to the first question, again, because time is short. Here goes. Who gets to decide where the line is drawn on whether an issue impacts internal university governance or not? The utility of the proposed bylaw comes down to how internal university governance is defined and operationalized, and more importantly, who gets to make that decision on how it's defined on an ongoing basis. The floor is open to our speakers.
I'm happy to
Thank you,
start, and
Christina.
I invite others to finish. So I'm grateful for the way that this conversation has started. I think these questions about what happens next, how is this bylaw implemented? These are really important questions, and I agree with the rest of the speakers that the bylaw itself doesn't answer them. So yes, absolutely, right? These are questions that need to be considered. Some of the lines that are drawn, that the bylaw requires us to draw, there are some gray areas. So yes, I agree. I think I disagree with the speakers in thinking that it's simply impossible to draw these lines, and we can go through some examples if that would be helpful. To my mind, it's best to engage some of these questions with specific concrete examples rather than at a very high level of abstraction. So I would invite this group to consider some additional examples. I'd like to say just a little bit more about my subcommittee's report. So it's been mentioned a few times. I do very much hope that the community will read it. I worry sometimes that the report, because it is a small part of a much longer document and we are all busy people, that it hasn't been read. So much of the discussion around the proposed bylaw to me suggests, but wait, nobody's read the report. The report, I am trying in my comments today to do it justice. That report is the product of a lot of careful deliberation among a group of faculty and staff. And I think it addresses not everything that we've touched on, but I think it addresses many of the important issues. The way that we understood our task was to describe substantively what we thought the right policy for this university was. That's a first step, right? You might think about that as a general principle that is at something like a constitutional level. But you still need statutes, you need regulations, you need FAQs, you need to think about who's going to be minding the store. All of these are important and valid questions, and we should talk about them.
Hank. You're on mute.
Hank, you're
On
muted.
this
Yeah.
question of being related to internal governance, I'm actually curious, and perhaps Christina might address this, as to why that phrase was used relevant to internal governance. The Calvin report, for example, which I have some problems with also, at least put it a little differently, and I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something like on issues that go to the heart of what the university is. And so that might address, for example, the concern I expressed in my remarks about what happened in Florida. Internal governance is a little different. It's both more vague, but also could be interpreted as much more restrictive, as just basically about how the university is run, rather than anything else. So I'm curious about why that language was chosen, perhaps not by the committee, by the subcommittee, perhaps by, I guess, the legal counsel or whoever. So
yes, I am happy to address this issue. The committee gives some examples of the kinds of things that we think are covered by the term internal governance, right? What do we have in mind? We have in mind things like, how does the University of Michigan admit students, right? So this is an especially salient example at the law school because 20 years ago, the University of Michigan, before the Supreme Court, articulated and defended its policy of affirmative action, right? This university, every university has to make a decision about how it is going to admit students. And we should do that. And we should explain the basis for the decision, right? And that decision should be explained in the context of the university's mission. Right? What is it that we're up to here? Right? There are many other related questions. Budgets, right? Where does the university allocate money? From whom does it solicit money? Curricular questions. Do we create a new degree conferring program? Who do we hire? How many administrative staff do we have? Right? There's a long list of issues that are internal administrative. I think it's helpful to think about them as relating to the infrastructure of how the university does its work. And I think it's entirely appropriate for the university to explain what it's doing and why it's made the choices that it has. I'm actually going to add another thing, which is to say, when the university is making these infrastructural operational decisions about how we run this institution, those decisions are contestable. They remain open to debate by every member of the community, right? They're not the last word on the best way to do any of the things that we do. So we wanted to make sure that we captured all of the places where university leaders must make decisions and where it's entirely appropriate that they defend them, and some of the other policies that are out there that are anchored in mission, for example. I think the question of what relates to the university's mission is even harder to answer than the question of what relates to internal governance. I think it's also important to remember that, and the abortion example I used, I think, illustrates this. There are facets of abortion that are internal governance, right? And the idea is university leaders, please focus on the internal dimensions.
Okay,
again,
can I just interrupt at that point?
Of
Because
course.
Basit has had his hand up and now Zilka has her hand up. And so I just want to make sure that all of the speakers have the chance to speak.
Of course.
Sure. So I think I agree with Christina that I think it would be nice if people read the report, especially from Subcommittee 3. But I think this issue of what is an issue of internal governance, this is a language that is also used in the report itself. And the bylaw, I think, lifts it from there. And the problem is, as we get from the discussion we're already having, is it's just not possible to define what is and what's not an issue of internal governance. The examples that were given nicely fit in, but as Silke mentioned, pretty much every contested issue out there that I can think of is going to be a matter of internal governance. And this issue that, like, I don't think, when we make any rules, we have to think through as to how those rules might have some unintended consequences, right? So having like clean-cut cases is not going to help us, right? Because we know how to deal with those cases already. The issue is when we have these gray areas, then you have to think about, like the example that I think Silke gave was one indirectly was what would happen, it seems. One possibility, I'm not saying that's going to necessarily happen, is the university is still going to take a stand on controversial issues. It's going to possibly stop making statements. It will stop possibly making statements, and it will not allow other experts on campus to make statements against the stand that they take. Because they would say this is not an issue of internal governance because they didn't make a statement on that, but they actually implemented a policy change. That is very much in line with what the proposed bylaw says. I know Subcommittee 3 did not come up with the language for the proposed bylaw, but that's what is going to be implemented eventually. So I think we have to discuss that.
Zilka.
Yeah, I want to add that this walling off of what we could variously call ideology or politics or ethics is, I think, a problem. Because as the report knows, right, and as you, of course, as everybody here knows, these convictions and ethical commitments inform the decisions we make. Now, we are saying, yes, we know this, but you cannot speak about them. And if you cannot speak about them, you cannot contest them. And I think that is a very bad idea, and I think it runs exactly counter to the thrust of the report, which I very much take, right? We must allow all kinds of dissent, right? Dissent must flow freely. People should not feel ostracized for having dissenting views, right? But they are, and this bylaw doesn't change that, right? But to basically ban the very reasons for which we pass policies strikes me as an exceptionally bad idea that actually suppresses the free exchange of ideas and contestations rather than supports them. So that, again, I would say better statements. Actually explain yourself, Regents. I voted for you, right? Tell me why you are doing what you're doing. Why did you change the statement of student rights and responsibilities, right? For what ideological reasons? Has it to do with the leak of ONO and the political pressure from Congress, et cetera, right? So that's my main concern, that we're actually driving really important deliberations underground with such a policy rather than making them visible and contestable.
Thank you, Zilka. A question came in from a physician about expressing concern about institutional neutrality, especially in relation to basic medical and public health tenets. Speaking here of the pandemic and reproductive health care, they said, I feel it's dangerous not to be clear where the University Medical Centre stands on things that affect the care we provide for patients. In addition, there were questions, and there's a group of questions about the speed with which this bylaw is being enacted. Why is the rush to get this passed? Why isn't SACUA involved? And there are variations on that theme throughout the Q&A. So I wonder if perhaps Christina, if you have any thoughts or could offer us any insight into the speed with which this is proceeding. Because that seems to be one of the most clear concerns throughout the Q&A that I'm seeing.
Sure. So when it comes to these questions about process, my subcommittee did not express a view on process. It did not express a view on the form that the policy would take. So I want to be clear about the limits of the subcommittee's views on this question. I will say too, this is my first foray into this kind of thing. I do not have well-developed views about norms or process. So I understand that there are questions, and this is just, I do not have a well-developed view, and my subcommittee emphatically did not offer a view about process.
Could I just ask a follow-up, which is, what were
Sure.
you told would happen about your recommendations? And then I'll come to you, Zilka.
Sure. So, We had some conversations during the summer as a committee about what the form of our recommendation would take, and we made a deliberate decision not to address the form of the policy, right? We viewed ourselves as setting out the general principles, the substantive general principles that should shape the university's approach to these issues. We were not the right body. We didn't have the right expertise to weigh in on questions of what form it ought to take or how it ought to be adopted. So I would say the subcommittee did not have specific expectations about what would happen next. Our focus was really doing our very best to articulate what we thought the policy ought to be and why we thought that was the right approach. I do just very quickly want to come back to Basit's point about the comments that came in from the community. We reviewed those comments for their substance, right, as qualitative contributions to this debate. And again, I think you'll see in our report our effort to respond to the specific arguments that we saw made in those comments. So we were really engaged with those comments in a substantive, qualitative way and deliberative way. Our goal was not, right, we did not look at those comments to understand some truth about where the community as a whole was in connection with these issues.
Thank you. Zilka.
Sorry, got to unmute myself. I take your point, Christina, that your subcommittee did not talk about this, but a member of a different subcommittee wrote to a public email list, so I feel fine sharing this. We wrote the report under the impression that we were addressing the whole campus, that our report would stimulate discussion among all campus groups, faculty, students, and staff. We did not think decisions would be made first by the higher administration before a broader campus discussion, importantly, including faculty governing bodies, was undertaken, and the higher admin listened to what different campus groups thought and actively consulted those groups. So this concern was definitely, the concern here voiced is definitely shared by at least some committee members. Now we know who convened the committee. It was OGC, right? It was the Office of General Counsel. And I know Tim Lynch, right? He has been pushing for the Calvin principles for a very long time. So I think that is one of the major forces behind it. The bylaw was then championed most aggressively by Regent Hubbard at the latest Regent meeting. So this is all inside baseball, but I think it's important.
Can I jump in with just one comment? So I'm aware, Zilka, of the communication that you are describing, and that communication came from a member of a different subcommittee than mine.
Yes, I know.
And I just want to be very clear, though, our three subcommittees met separately. We had completely different schedules, different memberships. And so I can't speak to the expectations of a member of a subcommittee that was not my subcommittee. I can speak to the expectations of my subcommittee.
So can I ask my
Yes,
question?
please.
So Christina, I just want to understand what is when the committee went in, what was the problem that they were trying to address? Is it that there are too many statements being made by the university, or they're not? Because that's not clear at all when I look at the report, either of the subcommittees. And the other thing which I want to mention, I don't want us to get hung up on the process, but it's hard to ignore, right? Because if there is clearly the committee was set up because administration thought there was a problem. Data was collected. And I just want to point out, like, the way data work, other universities have also set up similar committees. The response rates for similar surveys tend to be around 50%. The fact that you get responses from less than 2% of the community, did your committee talk about it? That could mean two things, right? One, that it was rushed, and that's why people didn't respond. Or secondly, people on campus didn't think there was an issue, right? That needed to be addressed. So one want to understand, and your subcommittee report does talk about looking over those comments. So when you looked over those comments, since they are from such a small proportion of the overall community, we have no idea who's speaking and who's not speaking. One, I want to understand how they were taken into account. And secondly, what is the broad problem that we're trying to fix here?
Sure. So let me address both aspects of what you're speaking about, right? So I want to be very clear when we're talking about what this institutional neutrality policy can accomplish. I want to be very careful to neither overstate nor understate what it can accomplish, right? This is not the magic bullet that is going to solve every issue related to freedom of expression and diversity of thought on this campus. This is an incremental step. In my view, it's an incremental step in a positive direction, but there is lots of ongoing hard work that remains surrounding this full set of issues. Among the members of our subcommittee were, right, mostly faculty members, one director of communication. So within our group, we had people who had experience drafting statements on behalf of university leaders. I myself served as associate dean at the law school for a 3-year term that ended this past summer. In that role, I saw how much pressure the law school dean is under to issue these kind of statements. I should say too, in my role as associate dean of the law school, I also played a role in working with my colleagues on the faculty and in the administration to put together a pop-up panel that took place within a week and a half of October 7. And that panel, arranging that panel may be the single thing I am proudest of during my term as associate dean. We had a packed auditorium of students who had the opportunity to hear from 2 different colleagues with expertise in international law and a colleague who's a clinical professor who focuses on this question of how do we engage in dialogue across difference? How do we try to connect with somebody who sees the world in a dramatically different way? And that, I'm going to say 2 things, right? That was really hard. Putting together that panel was not easy. It required a heavy lift from the panelists. It required a heavy lift from administrators. That heavy lift was invisible to many of the participants, but it contributed to the success of the event. And I see that as the example of the kind of thing that, as I said, that university leaders really ought to be doing, where they ought to be directing their attention, instead of writing statements. So part of the
Can I interrupt here and just say, because this speaks to a question of internal governance, and this is coming up in a lot of the questions in various different formats. So let me just read one. Internal governance is distinction without difference because the bylaw narrows to statements, but position taking shows up in so many more ways. Take the recent investment policy the Regents passed. It takes a position on tobacco and climate change, but won't allow what student protesters are calling for, which is divestment from companies complicit in genocide. So can the committee take that example up? Does institutional neutrality extend to the investment policy? And this is a question not just for Christina, but for all of the panelists.
I've been talking a lot, so I'll let others go first, but I'm happy to address this issue of tacit positions.
Zilka.
Yeah, it's one of these curiosities, right, that the regions both want to be able to speak on matters of internal governance, and nothing seems to strike me as more fitting that description than investment choices. That is certainly an internal governance. And at the same time saying the investment should be completely immune to ideological pressure, which we all know it is not because of Russia, fossil fuels, tobacco, palm oil, right? So I think this is just another example of the incoherence and, in fact, the hypocrisy of the discourse surrounding these policies. I could say more, but that's probably enough.
I'm not going to answer this specific question, but I think in response to something that Christina said, I do want to mention that I understand no one is disagreeing that something needs to be done. The status quo is not working. But what I worry about is, and I think committee, there's little for me to disagree with Subcommittee 3's report. I already mentioned the parts that I had some issues with, but the bylaw, to me, is not a movement in the right direction. It's introducing more uncertainty, more ambiguity, and I don't, Christine, I think you said you're proud of the report. I think you should be. I think we can agree that the bylaw is not going to help with any of the issues that we've discussed so far on this panel.
Okay, so is it all right, Lucy, if I
Yes, of course, yes.
respond? So on this matter of the university taking tacit positions through some of its actions, including its investment decisions, I am willing to concede that premise. The subcommittee 3 report is explicit that we did not take a position on divestment. We left that an open question. Our view was, even if the university is implicitly taking tacit positions through some of its action, that's not a persuasive rationale to allow for more of a practice that we viewed as problematic for the reasons that I have talked about. So to the extent that some tacit positions are simply unavoidable, because in many of these cases, the university has no choice but to make a decision, right? It can't avoid taking some kind of tacit position. To me, that's just not a persuasive reason to do more of it that's explicit. So that would be my response to the argument about tacit positions. I wanted to come back to Silke's comment about the regions. So as she noted, our report did not recommend extending this policy to the regions. And there too, right, I have no view. If we were to strike the regions from the bylaw, I would have no objection to doing that. But see, I'm so glad to hear that there's a lot in the subcommittee 3 report that you agree with. I guess I would love to hear, if not this bylaw, then what, right? I would welcome your suggestions for what a preferable alternative would look like. I don't agree with you that the bylaw won't help. I think the bylaw by itself is not good, right? It's not the end of the story. As I said earlier, there are lots of questions about what implementation looks like. But I just want to be very clear that I disagree with your view that the bylaw won't help. I would be interested in hearing,
Yeah,
right? If not that, then what?
Yeah, so I know Silke has to say
Okay.
something. So we don't have to agree on everything, but one thing, I think you earlier also conceded that it's a gray area. What is a matter of internal governance is a gray area. And my concern is the entire bylaw, it has all this language which is open to interpretation. And the instant that happens, any such bylaw can be easily abused. So that's my main concern here, right? Like, and I think you also earlier conceded that there are gray areas. Sure, we can talk about areas which clearly map into very nice, like black and white, but that's not the world we live in, and that's not why bylaws are made, because in those cases, we know how to deal with those situations. So I know Silke had to say something, so I'll
Yes,
stop.
I want to give Silke a chance to talk, but I would love to come back to this point about gray areas as well.
Silke.
It seems to me I read the entire report, not just 3, and I slogged through most of the 4,000 comments, which was a mixed experience, let's say. My sense is that the policy decisions or recommendations of the report don't actually cohere with the comments you collected. What people complained about in the comments was almost exclusively policy and social issues. So it was mostly, I don't believe in, many quotes, transgenderism, or I think abortion is murder, but I can't say that out loud because people will look at me funny. I don't think a ban of statements does anything about that. I think the issues, to the extent that I agree with them, I'm happy with certain positions being ostracized, frankly, but very few of them, right? But I think what the comments talk about is a cultural problem at the University of Michigan that cannot be addressed with this kind of heavy-handed yet vague policy. And how to do that is an incredibly difficult question, which we as pedagogues, of course, struggle with in the classroom all the time. So for instance, there were a lot of students say, I'm a conservative student, I don't say what I think because I will be graded lower. Now, the committee made no effort, as Basit pointed out, to figure out whether this was actually the case. And I can, of course, only talk for myself, but it is absolutely not the case. I beg my students to disagree with me. I beg them to argue with me, and they won't, right? I've had brilliant conservative students. I've had complete knucklehead conservative students. Same for my liberal and left students, right? So, and again, this perception of conservatives being retaliated against, excluded, not promoted, downgraded, and so on and so on, is, as Basit pointed out, a perception problem, and the report does not establish that it is an actual problem. But I think what we can all be fairly certain about, that a kind of ban on statements, which actually doesn't cover most of the statements that are made at the University of Michigan, will not help with that at all.
That
If I could
seems as good a
come in-
moment as any. We need to move. It's 1:55, and I'm aware of everybody's time here. To final 1 minute for each speaker to do final reflections, comments, clarifications. Christina.
So again, I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. I am heartened to see that although, right, although we don't disagree about we don't agree about everything, I think we have identified some areas where we do agree. And I think that is fantastic. If we had, 40 more hours over 12 weeks to continue to hash out these issues, we may find that we agree on quite a lot more. I want to come back to not wanting to overstate or understate the significance of this policy. I think it doesn't fix everything. Silke, when you're trying to shape a culture, right, it takes a lot of levers, and the work is indirect. For the reasons that I stated in my introductory comments, I think this is something that, while it wouldn't fix everything, would help move our culture in the right direction. And I think there's more to say, but I'll leave it at that.
Basit.
Sure. So I think there, as Christina mentioned, there's a lot to agree on. I have serious doubts about how the new bylaw will help us shape the culture. I think this is, and I'm going to go back to, I think, the issue that I mentioned earlier, and I want to just share a slide that I rushed through. What problem are we trying to fix? The entire subcommittee reports 1, 2, and even what fed into subcommittee report 3 only mentions about perceptions. We don't know whether these perceptions are well grounded. If they are, we need to address them. All of us would agree that we need to address them. There is absolutely no evidence that there is an actual culture problem. First of all, the data that was collected is not sufficient. The other thing that I do want to mention, some data out there, I have a student working on this. The fact is that we have very few conservatives on most college campuses. U of M is not any different from other flagship universities. This morning's New York Times article tries to, there's a new propaganda piece. I want to make it clear, when you read those pieces or you read the anecdotes, those are about perceptions. There is no data available. So the first thing that I would want all of us to do, and I think we all would agree on, is data needs to be collected to identify what the issue is. In the absence of that, any bylaw is just going to be, I don't know what it's going to fix. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Hank.
Well, first of all, again, let me thank you for it. It was really interesting and informative conversation. I just want to stress that clearly there are multiple problems that are sort of coming together here, some of which the policy really is, I think, largely irrelevant to. The question of intellectual diversity on campus, whether the university, and Michigan, as Basit just said, is not different from other similar universities. The atmosphere is welcoming to conservative or other minority thinking students. It is not going to be affected one way or another, I think, by the question of whether the institution can make political statements or not. And so I think we really have to make clear what is the problem that has to be addressed, And is this a way of addressing it?
Thank you. Zilka.
Yeah, I think this is bad law, bad bylaw. I think it's vague. I think it does not fix the problems the report identifies. I think it exacerbates some problems. I think it's unenforceable. It also doesn't include an enforcement mechanism, which I guess I'm grateful for. Maybe an SPG will follow. But yeah, I think it's I mean, it's a policy largely championed by conservative institutions in an attempt to move institutional policy away from the identity that colleges have. We are not the University of Chicago, and I'm grateful for that. We're a large public university, and I think we need different policies than what the Calvin Report, who was written by 5 dudes in the 1960s for the University of Chicago, argues for. Thanks.
Thank you. We unfortunately have to finish at this point. I want to thank all of the speakers. We recognize that we can't address all of the questions, but we hope that today's discussion will support continued conversations. We hope too that it won't be so rushed in terms of the regents putting this bylaw into place. A special thanks to our panelists then and to the event co-organizers, SACUA and the Ann Arbor chapter of AAUP. Also to Gretchen Keppel-Arex for help with questions, and an extra special thanks to Megan Blanchard and Luke McCarthy of the Faculty Senate Office for making this event happen in such short order. Thank you.